Greetings to all and welcome to the Seattle Law of One podcast. Today's episode is on quantum physics. Quantum physics is generally considered to be one of the most complex, hardest to understand of all the branches of scientists. But if you look at how it's been described by actual quantum physicists, you'll find that not only is it not that hard to understand, but that there's a huge amount of overlap between quantum physics and the Law of One. How so? Let's find out. My name is Jonathan Tong, and I'm facilitator for the Seattle Law of One study group. We can be found in the list of study groups at the L&L Research website shown on your screen. We do also have a Facebook group, and we do meet on Zoom twice a week, Tuesdays from 3 to 5 p.m. Pacific time, Saturdays from 8 to 10 a.m. Pacific time. You don't have to live in Seattle or anywhere near Seattle to join our Facebook group or our Zoom sessions. Anyone who's interested and available is welcome to join. You can contact us at seattlelawofone@gmail.com to get on our mailing list. We send out emails once a week to let folks know what we're talking about that week, as well as the Zoom links. We do also have a YouTube channel where we keep recordings of previous podcast episodes, as well as recordings of Q&A sessions with Jim McCarty, Austin Bridges, Gary Bean, and Tricia Bean of the L&L Research Channeling team. You can just go to our YouTube channel and hit the subscribe button if you'd like to get notifications when we upload new videos. And contact us at seattlelawofone@gmail.com if you would like to participate in any of our Q&A sessions. Otherwise, as mentioned, today's episode is about quantum physics. Let's go ahead and meet our panelists. Panelists, go ahead, let our viewers know who you are and where you're calling from, starting with Austin.
Hi, I am Austin Bridges calling in from Louisville, Kentucky. Nice. It's great to be here. Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. So looking forward to our conversation. And Yasi?
Hi, I'm Yasi Lotfi. I'm calling from Houston, Texas, and I am very excited to be on this panel and to be on your show.
We are super excited to have you on. Looking forward to it. And Grace?
Hi, I'm Grace Root, calling from South Florida, and I am looking forward to this conversation.
So great. Always great to have you on the panel, Grace. Did want to make clear to our viewers that none of us here are experts or authorities on the Law of One or on quantum physics. We are just normal people like you hanging out and having a conversation about quantum physics, you know, like normal people do. Anything that we say could be wrong. You're welcome to disagree with anything or everything that any of us say. If you are already familiar with the Law of One and the entity known as Quo, you might want to skip ahead to the chapter on book recommendation. Otherwise, for those who are new to the Law of One, you can think of the Law of One as a set of spiritual teachings based on the understanding that all is one and that one thing is love. More or less everything else you see in channeling transcripts is some variation of that statement. It's worth noting that all of the all the reading passages that we're looking at today from the Law of One came to us through the process of channeling, which can be thought of as a form of telepathic communication between humans and entities such as angelic beings, extraterrestrial beings, spirits of deceased, higher self, inner planes entities, etc. A channel basically serves as a mouthpiece for other entities to speak through. And in the case of the Law of One, those entities would appear to be entities of extraterrestrial origin. There's two types of channeling that have been done by our friends at L&L Research. Trance channeling is when the channel is in a trance state, subconscious or unconscious, as if asleep, meaning they're really not at all aware of what they are saying. This is how contact was made with the entity known as Ra back in the early 1980s. Conscious channeling is when the channel is in a conscious but deep meditative state, meaning they're only somewhat aware of the words that they are saying. This is how contact was made with the entity known as Quo, starting in the early mid-1980s up to present day. So who is Quo? You could think of Quo as a group entity made up of three social memory complexes: Ra at 6th density, Latui at 5th density, Hatan at 4th density. A social memory complex can be thought of as a planetary consciousness. It would be as if the entire human population of Earth was merged into one single mind, one single consciousness. You can think of densities as different levels of consciousness, different levels of reality. Just imagine that the elements of earth, fire, water, and air have some primitive form of consciousness, which, according to many indigenous earth peoples, they do. You could think of that as first density. You can think of second density as the level of consciousness of plants or animals. Clearly a quantum leap beyond the level of consciousness of inanimate matter. You can think of third density as the density of consciousness of humans and cetaceans like whales or dolphins. Again, a significant quantum leap beyond the level of consciousness of plants or other animals. You can think of fourth density as the level of consciousness of social memory complexes. Again, it would be the level of consciousness if the entire human population of Earth was merged into one single consciousness. Again, a significant quantum leap above the consciousness of an individual person. You can think of fifth density as whatever would be a comparable quantum leap above fourth density, and sixth density as whatever would be a comparable quantum leap above fifth density. So suffice it to say, it would appear that the entity known as Quo is a group entity made up of three planetary consciousnesses, one called Ra at sixth density, another called Latui at fifth density, and a third one called Hatan at fourth density. First contact was made by the LNL research channeling team in 1986, almost 2 years after the end of the Ra contact in 1984. And they have been channeled every month since then up to the present day by the LNL research channeling team, of which our friend Austin Bridges is a member, along with Gary Bean and Tricia Bean, and of course Jim McCarty. You can find transcripts from those channeling sessions in the LNL Conscious Channeling Library shown on your screen. Before we get into our readings, I did want our viewers know that I'll be sharing a lot of quotes from actual physicists, many of whom are Nobel Prize winning pioneers of quantum physics. And pretty much all of those quotations came from this book on your screen. It's called The Quantum Revelation by Paul Levy. It is by far the best book I've ever read on quantum physics. And I haven't read a lot of books on quantum physics because all the other ones that I tried to read were just too hard for me to understand. This book I found to be very readable, very accessible, very interesting, lots of connections to the law of one, and tons of quotes from actual quantum physicists, many more than you're going to see in our presentation today. So if you're interested in the podcast today, I would encourage you to check out that book. And you can get it at thriftbooks.com, my go-to online site for books. Otherwise, let's go ahead and take a look at what a couple of quantum physicists have said about oneness and consciousness. According to Werner Heisenberg, one of the great pioneers of quantum physics, known for his Heisenberg uncertainty principle, he once said that by getting to smaller and smaller units, we do not come to fundamental units or indivisible units, but we do come to a point where division has no meaning. David Bohm, another well-noted physicist, once said that inseparable quantum interconnectedness of the whole universe is the fundamental reality. Also said on another occasion, thus we could come to the germ of a new notion of unbroken wholeness, in which consciousness is no longer to be fundamentally separated from matter. I'm no physicist, and I've never won a Nobel Prize or anything, but I think they're basically saying that all is one. As far as I can tell, they're saying that at the most basic, smallest level, all is one, which is pretty much what the whole law of one is about. I'm going to go straight to the panelists for thoughts on this. Austin, any thoughts, reflections on these quotes?
Yeah, absolutely. I love these quotes, and it definitely, I agree, Jonathan, speaks about the law of one very clearly. And I think my understanding of how these quotes became relevant is the way that we as a, culture understood physics before quantum physics came along, is that the universe was made up of little bits of matter that were just bouncing around like bowling or billiard balls, basically. And that if we just broke it down small enough, we'd find the smallest piece of matter. And every indivisible piece of matter you could map and understand as sort of all this little pieces of everything. But then once they started looking smaller and smaller and zooming in more and more, they realized that that's not actually what's going on. And the smaller you got, the weirder things got. And these quotes, I think, speak to this idea that instead of little pieces of matter, everything, according to quantum physics, everything is sort of at that level excitations of a universal field or different universal fields. Like there's little waves and little excitations, and there's no like real solid division between anything. Like there's no little pieces of matter hitting each other. It's all just one thing kind of being excited in different ways, which I think is really cool. And it's one of the ways that I personally like to like introduce the idea of oneness to people who aren't into spirituality. Is imagine zooming in so small that just everything is just this one little unified field, and then that kind of your identity dissolves at that point. There is no distinction between me and you.
Super trippy for sure. And if I remember correctly, yeah, I think the era of modern physics started around the 1900s. And up to that point, physics was based on Newton and the idea that, like you said, everything is made up of atoms. We know that. So we'll figure this all out once we do all the rest of the calculations. And then it was discovered not long after that, yeah, when you start breaking atoms up into smaller and smaller pieces, yeah, all the laws of physics as we thought we knew them don't actually have effect. Yasi, any thoughts on anything here?
Yeah, Austin, I love that you brought it to the one unified field because I feel like I was going through some of the key concepts of what I understand in quantum physics, which is like quantum physics for dummies. And unified field, I feel like is as one of the main concepts, this idea that like there is this connected field that, you know, connects entangled particles or this kind of 0 point field, or there are different ways of describing it. And as I was thinking about it, I thought of the idea of intelligent infinity because yes, there are these like separate beings right now talking and, you know, we are separate atoms. But if you zoom in further and further, you come to, as Jonathan quoted, to a place where division has no meaning. And in my opinion, that's like a field at that point. That's like intelligent infinity. That is like indivisible. What's the word for that? You can't divide that one. You know, it's
Yeah.
like a one thing. And it's from this that, like you said, like excitable things begin to emerge. So, and I have more to
Yeah.
say about that later, but I love that idea of the unified field.
Yeah, super fascinating. And that's something I haven't really looked into or studied. So I have nothing to add on that subject in particular. Grace, did you have any thoughts on anything here or anything that's been said?
Just one thing, the word you have in blue here, well, part of the words, interconnectedness, it makes me think of infinity, and it makes me think of this very specific quote from the Law of One. That which is infinite cannot be many, for manyness is a finite concept. To have infinity, you must identify or define that infinity as unity. Otherwise, the term does not have any referent or meaning. And that's my favorite quote from the Law of One, and it just makes me think of the interconnectedness of the whole universe.
Yeah, just so amazing and mind-boggling. Yeah, anyone who says they understand all this stuff almost certainly doesn't understand anything about it. It is about infinity. Speaking of which, I did have a passage from Quo that spoke on the subject of the Law of One and the connection perhaps to these quotes. Did anybody on the panel have any other thoughts wanted to share on these particular three quotes before we move on?
A quick
No.
humorous thought, and that's just a quote from a famous physicist named Lord Kelvin from before quantum physics was discovered to be a thing. He famously said, "There is nothing new to be discovered in physics now. All that remains is more and more precise measurement." And then after he said that, quantum physics was discovered, and all that went out the window.
I think it's that quote I was thinking of. I remember my high school physics teacher making some reference to that. Was that around the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s?
I believe, yeah, late 19th century, yeah.
Yeah. And that's the Kelvin, as in the Kelvin temperature scale, I think.
Yeah, the guy that the Kelvin temperature is named after, so he's kind of a big deal.
It's kind of a big deal. Yeah, just like Ron Burgundy. Uh, So did want to note, we're going to throw in some physics lessons along the way here too. For folks who didn't know, Werner Heisenberg is, again, a Nobel Prize winning physicist who is known for discovering what is known now as the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which basically says you cannot know both the speed and location of an electron at the same time. You can know one or the other. You can't know both with absolute certainty because the simple act of observing something at that small a scale affects the system. So the whole boundary between subject and object gets a little bit blurry. So this passage was from Quo, and it is from November 9th, 2019. Quo said, "The law of one says simply that all things, all beings, all is one infinite creator, intelligent infinity, that which is all that is. Consciousness is a portion of the one infinite creator that becomes enabled or created when the universe begins to take shape as the one infinite creator and through free will creates the logos or love, which creates light, which then condenses into the creation that is made of consciousness. Thus, the consciousness comes from the one infinite creator's unity. As each entity perceives its own consciousness, then, it discovers that it is related to all other entities through this consciousness, through its various levels of consciousness within its own being that move through the roots of the tree of mind into the subconscious, into the planetary consciousness, into racial consciousness, into cosmic consciousness, into the consciousness of all that is created. Thus, if each entity begins to examine its consciousness, then it discovers that it is as related to the one infinite creator as is any other entity or any other portion of the one infinite creation. Thus, to know the consciousness of the self is to know in microcosm that which is in macrocosm. Thus, the one infinite creator knows itself in each iota of beingness of its creation, and each iota of beingness of the creation knows itself as the one infinite creator. Such a beautiful passage that I think sums up the law of one in such a beautiful, eloquent way and seems to affirm what Mr. Heisenberg and Mr. Bohm were saying in our previous passages. Did want to note in that third paragraph, they didn't use the word hologram, but in other passages, Quo has many times said that the universe is holographic, a hologram being a three-dimensional image that's projected into space with the aid of lasers. And it is as such that every part of the hologram contains the image of the whole. If you look at the picture of the star, the holographic image of the star on your screen right now, if you were to tear that picture in half, each half would still have the picture of the whole. And if you took each of those halves and just kept tearing them into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, you could tear them into a million pieces. Each piece would still contain the whole, which I believe is what Quo was saying here when they're saying the microcosm, that is the macrocosm. Thus, the one infinite creator knows itself in each iota of its beingness, of its creation, and each iota of beingness of the creation knows itself as the one infinite creator. Each part, down to the smallest scale, still contains the whole. That's just mind-blowing, to me at least. Yasi, did you have any thoughts on this passage?
Yeah, I feel like it's beautiful and there's so much to unpack here. Like you can go so many different directions. So I'll just think of one of them, which is the idea of this interconnectedness. And when I read this, I thought one of the main concepts of quantum physics is this idea of entanglement. And usually we think of that as like particle entanglement, meaning like sort of, if I understand it, two particles, let's say, that come from an original source that have somehow been linked when they're separated by distance are still linked. And so affecting one affects the other. And recently I've gotten really interested in this idea of entangled minds, like just entangled consciousness, not just particles, but minds being entangled, consciousness being entangled. And if we all think that we came from one original source, so we're all entangled, actually, right? Like we're all one. We originated from a source and then we were spread out into these multiple experiences. Then every part of us, physical, mental, spiritual, is kind of entangled, and so we really are connected consciousness, the effect of one's consciousness, affects others in an entangled way. Like when something happens in my consciousness, it's happening in other people's in a connected way, and it's connected to the source at the top level, I guess. So I always think of that like somehow we're entangled forever to the one infinite source that gave rise to our own consciousness. And not to mention that there's that field of consciousness, right? Like there is this kind of general field of consciousness that we tap into, which is maybe the same thing. Our interconnectedness is like a field of connection, if that makes sense.
It makes as much sense as anything else in quantum physics does. And I appreciate your bringing the entanglement term in because, yeah, I think that is important. And I think it's so easy for folks who are like, not into science to get thrown off by all of these terms like quantum entanglement and such. But I mean, they're fancy sounding words, which are really just fancy way of saying what you said, which is that, well, everything's connected. If all is one, then of course, all minds are connected or entangled, as it were. Grace, anything to add?
Yeah, I really like what you said, Yasi. I think it really speaks to this idea of change, though, because if you personally change, then you are making a change within humanity because, we are all connected. And Quo and Ross speak about the planetary mind, our social memory complex of Earth. And I think that on that level is how change takes place. I wanted to speak about like the experiential piece of this, which is that sense of being, which is behind everything. And we can access that when we surrender. And Ra and Quo speak to that surrendering. But, when we think about surrendering, we think about doing, and we're like, oh man, I'm doing surrender. But really, it's the act of letting go. When you say it's an act, you're like, oh, I'm doing it again, but it's not. It's just letting everything go. And when you let go of your thoughts, your body, and your feelings, you can experientially know this unified feeling that's there.
What a beautiful way to look at it. I had not thought of that at all, but that makes perfect sense and appreciate your sharing that with us and the viewers. That's why I love these podcasts and panel discussions. Panelists always think of things that never occurred to me, so appreciate that. Austin, anything to add?
Yeah, that was really beautiful. And it makes me think about what we were talking about with those last quotes, where we were talking about if you zoom in more and more, everything starts to look like one unified field. But then if you turn that inside, that I think that's what Kuo is talking about, and what Grace and Yasi were mentioning too, is you look more and more inside and closer and closer examining what's inside, you come right into contact with that unified field where you realize that separation is an illusion. Just like the separation between the atoms everywhere is an illusion, separation between my mind and your mind is also an illusion. And you can have that direct experience of that with, surrender and meditation. So yeah, that's really cool.
Indeed. Yeah, I think in many ways you could say that quantum physics is really just the study of how the universe works at the very, very smallest level. And at the very smallest level, all is one single consciousness. That's pretty trippy. It's nice that scientists are discovering oneness, I guess you could say.
Jonathan, can I say one more thing about that?
Yeah, please.
Just going back on actually, Grace, I think you hinted at this, and Austin, you did too, but the idea of the social memory complex, going back to the connection of consciousness, that's a level above our individual consciousness, right? Not inhibited any longer by an individual body. Now you are thousands of bodies sharing one field of consciousness. I mean, that's basically what Ra and Quo are, and we have evidence, let's say, that we become more connected to a larger field of conscious understanding when we go above densities, and probably are capable of doing that on this one, but are inhibited by different things.
Indeed. Well said. Anybody else have anything to add before I change the slides, change the passage? Cool. I did want to note, since we've been talking a fair bit about one infinite creator, we did have a podcast episode on the one infinite creator. It was episode 26, not that long ago. And There's a number of things that we'll be talking about in this podcast that we talked about more in depth in that episode. So if you enjoyed this podcast episode, might want to check that one out. Otherwise, let's take a look at a couple other quotes from some other pioneers in quantum physics. We have already heard from Mr. Heisenberg, and here Werner Heisenberg said, a complete separation of the observer from the phenomenon to be observed is no longer possible. Another pioneer in quantum physics, Erwin Schrödinger, said, the total number of minds in the universe is one. In fact, consciousness is a singularity phasing within all beings. Again, spelling out pretty much, I think, what we just said a few times, that, yeah, there's one single consciousness, one single thing in the universe. The universe is conscious, and it's one single consciousness. That's just mind-blowing to be sure. Grace, any thoughts on this? Anything here?
Well, gosh, every time you say Heisenberg, I just think of Breaking Bad. So they did Heisenberg a service.
That's right. I forgot about that. Thank you. Good pop culture reference.
Gotcha. No, I guess I come back to this idea of oneness and that we are all one, and just, like you said, it's this illusion of separateness. And, from the time we're born, we're given this name and this identity, and then we attach it to ourselves and we grow up saying that we're this thing, we're this person. But when you really look at it and ask yourself, who is that person? You find there is no person. That, there is no grace per se. This idea of grace is an idea. And when you can look at that and examine that and get beyond that, you get to feel what these guys are talking about. And it's just a beautiful thing.
Yeah, and I appreciate your sharing it that way, because it is so easy to see science as just a very left brain, technical, logical thing, devoid of emotional content or emotional meaning. But yeah, definitely when I read these, I get very strong emotional reactions to these, and I think that's important. Austin, anything to add?
Yeah, I appreciate that outlook too. I think there's, like Grace was saying, it's sort of like a gnosis, this discussion of quantum mechanics. It resonates like internally more than, that sort of classical idea of the billiard balls bouncing around in the universe. So I think there is something really kind of spiritual about this, because it does like feel a lot more in line with what we know in our hearts to be true, this sort of unified field. And these two quotes, they both speak about some really fascinating, weird stuff about quantum physics, being like the effect of the observer on what is being observed, and the fact that there's two things that can be on like opposite ends of the universe that are connected and can influence each other immediately, and we don't understand that. And the only way to really think about that is that they're one thing. There's no separation between the two. They are literally just one thing, appearing to be on different sides of the universe. So it's really mind-blowing.
That would be an example of quantum entanglement, right? Two
Yeah.
electrons on opposite ends of the universe that are somehow affecting each other.
Yeah, we haven't figured out exactly how that works, and we don't know how to like use that to send information yet. But we do know that if you observe this particle on this side of the universe, you automatically influence the particle on the other side of the universe. And the only way that really seems possible is if there's just one, like he's saying, one mind that both of these things are a part of.
Right, right. Yeah, amazing. Yasi, anything to add?
Well, I think you guys really did it justice. So I can't add anything on that front, but I feel like it speaks a little bit to some of the woo stuff that, you can't discuss in like normal conversation with anyone because they think you're crazy, but just the idea of like synchronicity or telepathy or all these things that like literally I can't talk to anybody about, but they make sense when you look at the universe like this, you're like, oh, I understand that I can telepathically converse with someone, especially someone that I have some kind of a, let's say, connection with, because somehow we become entangled closer than a non-connected person, and maybe our minds become entangled, and maybe when I think something, they can feel it or hear it. I mean, again, if you say this just in a void, people think you're crazy. But I honestly think if you add physics to it, it begins to sort of be a possibility, you know? And I just love that I can bring those concepts and use this physics to justify them because I like those concepts
For
a
sure.
lot.
Yeah, I think it is largely this merging of science and spirituality and art, I suppose you could say, that kind of brings everything together in a beautiful way that I think we'll probably be seeing more of. If no one else has anything to add on here, I did want to note that Erwin Schrödinger is, again, another pioneering Nobel Prize winning physicist who actually coined the term quantum entanglement back in 1935, like almost 100 years ago. He coined the term that now is seen like cutting edge and hip in metaphysical circles. But perhaps better known than Schrödinger is probably Schrödinger's cat. If you are not familiar with this, our viewers, Schrödinger's cat is a thought experiment that Schrödinger came up with, suggesting that imagine a cat that's been put in a sealed box with a flask of poison and some radioactive material. If the internal radiation monitor detects radioactivity, like a single atom decaying, then that triggers a reaction which causes the flask to be shattered, releasing the poison, killing the cat. And the radioactive material has such a half-life that there's basically 50 chance of the decay happening at any given moment. The idea being that theoretically the cat could be considered both alive and dead while unobserved in its closed box, its fate being linked to a random subatomic event that may or may not occur, and it's only in the act of observation that you figure out if the cat is dead or alive. This was meant to be a metaphor for how things work at the very subatomic level. I don't think it necessarily holds true on the macroscopic level for a cat. But I think one thing we could say for sure about Erwin Schrödinger from looking at his picture, he looks like a guy who would do that to a cat. That is not a flattering picture of Mr. Schrödinger. That fucker looks like a cat killer if I ever saw one.
That's not fair.
That's not fair. I just picked the picture that was in Wikipedia. Don't
But
blame it on me.
probable.
Blame
It's
it on
probable.
Wikipedia. Yeah. But as any meme aficionados know, there are quite a few memes out there about Schrodinger's cat, including the ones shown on your screen about Schrodinger's cat walking into a bar and not, or the Urban Dictionary definition of Schrodinger's douchebag, a guy who says offensive things and decides whether or not he was joking based on the reaction of people around him. Or other two more cat memes, modeled after the famous Drake meme and the even more famous Dos Equis guy meme. I'm not going to bother reading them. I'm not going to bother trying to explain them. You have to see it on video. And if you think it's funny, you're welcome. If not, we're going to move on. So, let's take a look at what has been said about what in the Law of One is referred to as one original thought. Physicist and mathematician James Jeans once said, "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine." Famous astronomer Carl Sagan once said, "We are a way for the universe to know itself." Physicist Henry Stapp said, "We live in an idea-like world, not a matter-like world." Legendary quantum physicist John Wheeler said, "We go down and down from crystal to molecule, from molecule to atom, from atom to nucleus, from nucleus to particle, and there's still something beyond both geometry and particle. In the end, we have come back to the mind." And again, Nobel Prize winning theoretical physicist Max Planck once said, "Mind is the matrix of all matter," and said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness." Really cannot overemphasize the size of what's being said by Mr. Planck there. He's saying that, according to him, this Nobel Prize winning physicist, matter is derived from consciousness, not the other way around. Most people you would ask on the street, I would say, would take the other opinion, that mind is just something that's a product of atoms and molecules and chemicals in your brain interacting to create this phenomenon that we call mind. But Planck is saying, no, it's the other way around. Everything we think of matter is really just a construction of the mind. And that is mind-blowing. I definitely should have gotten high before this episode. I'm regretting it. But this is now just my baseline consciousness that all is one. And yeah, I get it. Yeah, we're all brain cells in a giant cosmic mind. Yeah, I get it. Back to you, Austin. What do you think? Any thoughts on this?
Absolutely. This is I understand quotes like these, it talks about this two different philosophical views of how the universe comes into being. Is it matter, the fundamental like substance of the universe, and our consciousness is just this weird spark that comes out of that? Or is consciousness and mind somehow underneath everything and matter comes up from that? And that's really like the challenge that quantum physics gave to scientists, especially physicists are like the materialists. They are the ones who believe that matter is fundamental. And then along comes an even more advanced form of physics that says, no, that's actually not true. Matter doesn't even really exist in that sense when you get down to that most basic level. And my understanding too is that basically science today is still mostly materialist, despite the fact that these scientists and quantum physicists have shown that that's likely not true. But there is a shift happening, especially in academic philosophy, where the idea that mind is more fundamental, which is what they call that idealism, or other types of like idealism, like panpsychism or something like that. That's actually becoming more and more accepted in academia, that there is a shift that is actually happening. It's not just people like us talking about it. There's people in universities that are really buying into this worldview.
Yeah, I've heard many times that the science of the future is going to be the science of consciousness. I think there is a large grassroots awakening coming to that, I
Yeah.
believe. Yasi, anything to add?
First of all, I can't wait for that moment, just saying. Um, yes, so I think this makes me think of the original idea of the law of one, which is the first distortion of the law of one was free will, and that the action of free will upon love was light. So I feel like that's the spiritual way of maybe describing the physical manifestation of matter from energy, from things that were matterless. Because, the free will maybe is the mind that we're talking about, right? Out of no distortion comes the original distortion, which is the free will, which is this like creative force or creative desire to want to produce something, to want to see something in front of itself. And then that free will, that mind then acts upon the creative nature of itself and makes light. And the funny thing is, light in both physics and law of one are the sort of like manifestors of matter, I guess, because we're not just talking about like light, like, oh, you're so full of light, but like actual vibrating particles of light giving rise to matter. So when I think about the quantum physics aspect of that, I don't know how much you guys know about the Higgs field or the Higgs boson. I know I was like all giddy about it in 2012 because like it's the God particle. Just in a
Yeah, talk
nutshell,
about it. I can't say it's something I'm real familiar with. Can you talk about it a little bit?
I can't say that I can do it any real justice because I feel like anytime I talk about these topics, I'm such a dummy compared to like the actual smart people, but I'll do what I think I get from it, which is the idea is that there's a all connected field called the Higgs field, and it's kind of the thing that gives energy its matter, like everything is massless and just
Hmm.
wandering as energy through space. And this field that is one connected field gives things matter, gives them mass, and the field is made up, or the particles associated with that field are called the Higgs boson. And when things interact with that Higgs boson, they all of a sudden they get different kinds of mass depending on their vibration. So I mean, that's sort of like the idea of there is first nothing, there's just potentiality, there's just this energy, but then something gives it mass, like free will acting on love creates light. Things moving through the Higgs field are given mass and become matter, things that were just energy, things that were just potential. So I find it fascinating that there is some analogy between those two explanations of how something gained matter in the first place. And in the idea of like the Higgs field, like there was nothing until there was first energy, then there was matter. There was first mind, then there was matter. Like matter was definitely not the first thing.
Right. Yeah, super fascinating. And you did a great job of explaining it to the degree that my little walnut-sized brain can understand it. I think I understand what you're saying. Yeah, and that is fascinating. It reminds me of what's said in the very first quote from James Jeans: "The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine." We're kind of used to thinking of the universe as just like a big machine, a giant clock, and all these little pieces that are moving around and such. But he's saying it really seems more like a thought, and that God particle that you're talking about sounds like a scientific way of explaining how matter was derived from consciousness, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Well said. Yeah. Grace, anything to add?
Oh, thank you, Yasi. I didn't know what that concept was, and I think, yeah, you gave me a great rundown on the idea, and it makes me think that we're all of these different things like quantum physics, and then you have a different groups of esoteric knowledge and spiritual knowledge, and they're all saying the same thing in different ways, and it's just more confirmation that we are shifting. Kind of like what Austin said, you do see the shift, and I love the shift in academia. I'm coming for that. I really enjoy the idea of these higher education institutes, speaking about these things, and it does represent a bigger shift. And I guess it just kind of begs the question, if our level of understanding is relating to our beingness, and everyone's beingness is kind of going from third density to fourth density, how is it that we bring these concepts, how do they spread? How does everyone get to know about them? And I think that we see this in the field of quantum physics. These guys are saying it right there.
Indeed. Well, and I think it goes back to what you were saying about the emotional part of it. James Jeans was saying in that first quote that the universe looks more like a great thought than a great machine. But as Ra and Kuo have said, that original thought that everything came from is actually love, and that everything in the universe is not just made of a thought, but that thought is actually love. And it changes everything, I think, about the way you look at the universe. And I think maybe that awakening understanding could be a beautiful thing too. Reminds me, I think there was a passage from the very first session of the Raw Contact that speaks to this. Anybody want to add anything before we take a look at that?
What do physicists call love? What's the scientific word for love?
I don't think they've gotten to that.
That's such a
part
good
yet.
question.
Yeah, I have not gotten.
There's biological chemicals and neurons firing to
Yeah.
try to produce.
I hate that explanation. I
evolution.
always have that explanation coming from people who are like the materialists. I'm like, no, but
Yeah.
don't you feel it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose in a way, I mean, it's both true. I mean, you could say
Yeah.
that Romeo and Juliet is just a bunch of little black dots printed on a page, and to some degree that's true, but it's also a lot more than that.
Yeah, it's a very small fraction of the truth.
Yeah, indeed. I did want to note for viewers who are already familiar with quantum physicists like Heisenberg and Schrödinger and Max Planck, John Wheeler is somebody I never heard of before I read that Quantum Revelation book that I mentioned before, but that book is dedicated to him, and he's a fascinating person as I learned about him. Really amazing, beautiful, inspirational mind who discovered a lot of his ideas about quantum physics through dream states and other things. And he is, I believe, the person who invented the term wormhole. So anytime you're seeing a science fiction movie where somebody takes a piece of paper and folds it in half and sticks a pencil through it to show how you could travel from one part of the universe to the other through a wormhole, that's John Wheeler right there.
Wow.
Fascinating dude. And again, if you read that book, you'll learn a lot more about him. Otherwise, yeah, we should take a look. One of the very first things that Ross said in the very first contact with the channeling team back in the 1980s was, The confederation of planets in the service of the infinite creator has only one important statement. That statement, my friends, as you know, is all things, all of life, all of the creation is part of one original thought. Let us consider for a moment thought. What is it, my friends, to take thought? Took you then thought today? What thoughts did you think today? What thoughts were part of the original thought today? And how many of your thoughts did the creation abide? Was love contained and was service freely given? You are not part of a material universe. You are part of a thought. You are dancing in a ballroom in which there is no material. You are dancing thoughts. You move your body, your mind, and your spirit in somewhat eccentric patterns, for you have not completely grasped the concept that you are part of the original thought. Just love that first part of the last paragraph. You are not part of a material universe. You are part of a thought. You are dancing in a ballroom in which there is no material. You are dancing thoughts. It's such a beautiful poetic way of expressing what we heard in other words from other entities, third density entities. Any thoughts on this, Yasi?
That's one of my favorite quotes of the whole raw material. I just like you are dancing thoughts comes out of my head all the time. I love it.
Yeah.
I think the thing that this brings up for me is this idea of thoughts in general. Like if we think of the original thought, and Jonathan, you were saying like the original thought is, or Austin, you were saying was love. If the original thought is love, and then we go about our days, with the like monkey mind and all the scattered thoughts and all the thoughts flooding in, and like so many of them not even really consciously aware of them, and they're not always constructive, they're not always kind, they're not always true, like such a deluge of thoughts. This makes me think about noticing the quality of your thoughts, like did you have thought today? You definitely did. But which thoughts were the original? Like which thoughts were truly of the quality of the original thought? And not to say that you should be down on yourself or judge yourself because you did not have good thoughts, but it's good to be able to parse them and consider, how many of these thoughts do I want to just pass? Like, may you be on your way. And how many of them are like really sticking to me because they're part of the original thought. They're kind, they're true, they're love, they're interesting, they're clarify things, they help me be aware. That to me, that's what this brings up for me is just to be able to sort through thoughts and be aware of them and, the quality of them, I guess.
Indeed. Yeah, and I think that's a big part of what meditation is about, is examining your thoughts, thinking about your thoughts, not fixating them, kind of letting them rise and let them fall away from awareness, but at least being aware of your thoughts. And I like your highlighting that part, since I think most of us go through our day without thinking about our thoughts and thinking about how many of our thoughts were actually the original thought of love, as opposed to Schrodinger cat memes or something like that.
Those are okay too.
It's okay. Grace, anything to add?
I guess it kind of makes me think, like what Yasi was saying is, what are we thinking, right? Where do these thoughts come from? Are we thinking these thoughts? Are we just aware of these thoughts? And it makes me think, can we become aware of that one original thought, which is love, which is of course we can, right? But to do that, it takes conscious effort. And I think that's something that we can all strive to do. And I really enjoy this. I am honored to have been thought of. I mean, what a freaking honor it is to exist. I was thought of, huh? That's crazy.
That's awesome.
One of many sparks from the one infinite creator, apparently. So beautiful. Yeah. Austin, anything to add?
I just love all the reflections. And like Grace asked earlier, what do scientists call love? I think Ra's taking things a bit further in this quote than the quantum physicists, because they're discovering that you get down to the most basic level, it all looks like thought. But they didn't say, what is that thought? Where did that thought come from? What is there? But I think that's where we have to start, concentrating on our own thoughts, our own feelings, and use ourselves as those instruments to figure out, okay, if the universe fundamentally is thought, we have thoughts, what is that and how can we get to the heart of it? And I think that's where the love thing comes in. That's where like the resonance of love, whatever love is in the context of the one original thought, I think it's incomprehensible from our point of view, but we can sense that when our thoughts are aligned with that love, there's a resonance. And like Ra talks about, we're dancing thoughts. I think then we are in tune with that music in that stage. And I think that's maybe we're at a point where science is sort of hit that brick wall, and now we have to use our own, hearts and mind instruments to start detecting even further beyond that.
Yeah, because we're not aware of it, and so many of our thoughts are such distorted forms of the one original thought. We're just not aware that we are moving our bodies and minds and spirits in somewhat eccentric patterns where we have not completely grasped the concept, are not completely hearing the music. That passage always reminds me of the Elaine dancing scene in Seinfeld. You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
That's how I dance too.
I was so tempted to put the video clip in here. In fact, I had it on a slide and I was going to share it with our viewers, but I thought, that's a little bit too much of a digression. But those of you who've seen that scene know what we're talking about. Just a really hilarious, eccentric dance. That's what I think of me doing. Yeah, for sure. I think I did have one other passage from Quo wanted to look at here. Anybody had anything on this passage wanted to share before we look at something else?
Jonathan, I wanted to say something. Austin, I think everybody kind of pointed to this idea of like, where do the thoughts come from? And it made me think of what we were talking about in the beginning, which was this idea of like a connected field of consciousness, group consciousness, how we're like tapping into some greater field where all thoughts are just like hanging out and floating. And I don't know if I've ever thought of it like this, but what if like so many of our thoughts are just like the thoughts that are floating around? They're not necessarily ours, but they're just being put into the general field by everybody. And we're just allowing it all just to flow through and to become more and more like, not, ourselves. I don't want to condone necessarily separateness, but just to be our authentic original dance means a little bit of just like, again, like realizing a lot of those thoughts are maybe just things that are not even our own, right? We're plugged in, we're like taking them like radio signals.
For sure. I think any of our thoughts that we are conscious of are like what's left over after we process all of our unconscious thoughts. And I think it kind of goes down into the roots of, I think, what was mentioned in one of our earlier passages, down from our individual minds to racial mind, to the planetary mind, to the archetypical mind, and at the deepest level to the cosmic mind. I think it would be fair to say that every thought you have is indeed coming from that as its original source.
That's true.
Yeah, just distorted into whatever crazy thoughts we're thinking at the moment.
But I think,
So,
like,
yeah.
to add on to that, I think that the thoughts that we have correspond to our vibration. And so we're able to cultivate this sense of higher thoughts when we raise our vibration.
I love that. That's so true.
So, indeed.
Yeah. Awesome.
That is what we're here for, I think. Try to teach.
Yeah, I think so.
Let's take a look at another passage. This was from November 12th, 1995, and Quo said, "The one great original thought that has set all into motion is the creation itself, that which you experience at this time and that which is beyond your current ability to perceive, but which shall become more and more available to you as you progress in your own evolutionary journey. To say that the one great original thought is the Logos is to somewhat misapply the term Logos, for the one thought of the Creator was the thought that it would know itself. This is the concept of free will as you know it." It reminds me, I think, of that quote we saw from Carl Sagan a couple slides back, where he said, "We are a way for the universe to know itself." I remember hearing him say that like decades ago when I was in my late teens, early 20s, and I thought it was pretty cool. And it sort of made sense at the time. But yeah, to hear it expressed this way through Quo really, I think, drives it home in a deeper way that, yeah, every single one of us is apparently a spark of the one infinite creator flung out from the beginning of this universe to explore and learn more about itself and find out what it is to be Jonathan, what it is to be Yasi or Austin or Grace or you random person watching this on video. I just find that super beautiful and super inspiring, including that all the people that we really don't like either are also the same. They are also the creator sent out to explore what creator looks like when he's being a douchebag or whatever it is that person that we don't like. Well, what do you think, Grace? Any thoughts on this?
Nothing from me right now.
That's good. We can come back to you later if you want. Austin, anything on this?
I just really like this quote. Thanks for finding it. I do, I have questions about they say here that it's to say that the one great original thought is the logos, it's to somewhat misapply the term logos. And so it seems like the situation's a bit more complicated because, as we were saying, that one original thought of love would also be logos, but it's actually the one thought of the creator was that it would know itself. So I think maybe we just use love to love is the pathway that the creator got to where we are to know itself, and then we use love to get back to that point. It's sort of like that recapitulation that they talk about. But other than that, I just really appreciate the quote. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. It's a beautiful way to look at it. I, again, had not thought of it in exactly that way. It makes perfect sense. Yasi, anything to add?
That was really, really a lovely way to think of it. I think that one interesting thing I find in the idea of creation is that there's obviously the original creator, and yes, we're like these far-flung sparks of that, but we're also not like passive sparks, right? We each then become our own little like sub logos and have our own small acts of creation, obviously, by our ability to use our free will, by our moment to moment choices that we make, how we use love in the moment. And so that at times gives me comfort and at times makes me feel like a lot of responsibility because I am helping create the creator's experience, and at my best, I'm like, yay, like I'm creating magic. And like when I'm at my worst, I'm like, I'm so sorry like, that this is the experience you're having, creator, Like sometimes I'm like,
It's not my fault.
sorry, like, sorry, I'm sure there are way better creators right now than me. Sorry, this is your experience today. No, but like all joking aside, it's like it's that active part that I find interesting, and obviously that gives us ownership and our own existence and makes this whole thing almost more exciting and, every day kind of a challenge and adventurous, and because we get to create in our small ways.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's so easy to forget in all the intense drama of what's going on in late third density. But yeah, to be able to will oneself to get to that place, I think is a beautiful, worthy thing to aspire to for sure. Let's see. I think I was ready to change topics. Does anybody else have anything they wanted to say about this or one original thought before we change topics? Sounds good. Loving the discussion. I did want to note for our viewers that I think we're about an hour in and still got a little ways to go. So I want to encourage our viewers that don't ever feel like you need to watch these episodes all the way through. You can stop it at any point, put it in your watch later list, and when you come back to it, it'll pick up wherever you left. And we always divide the episodes into chapters, so you can always skip around however you want to find whatever it is you are looking for. Otherwise, since we have been talking so much about mind and thought and consciousness, I would like to take a closer look at physics and psychology. Austin and Yasi, as I recall, you guys are big fans of Carl Jung, right? Father of psychoanalysis, as are many, I believe, in the law of one community. But for viewers who didn't know this, Carl Jung had a decades-long friendship with Nobel Prize-winning physicist Wolfgang Pauli. They wrote each other tons of letters, met several times in person, shared ideas with each other that really, I think, helped each learn more about their own fields as well as the overlap between their respective fields. So got a few quotations from those two gentlemen. Wolfgang Pauli said, "For me personally, the relationship between physics and psychology is that of a mirror image." Also said, "It seems that there must be very deep connections between soul and matter, and hence between the physics and the psychology of the future, which are not yet conceptually expressed in modern science." also said on another occasion, "It is impossible for me to find this correspondence between physics and psychology just through intellectual speculation. It can only properly emerge in the course of the individuation process." Carl Jung said, "Only from his wholeness can man create a model of the whole." And also said, "Modern physics is truly entering the sphere of the invisible and intangible, as it were. It is in reality a field of probabilities, which is exactly the same as the unconscious. We, physics and psychology, are both entering a sphere which is unknown. The physicist enters it from without, and the psychologist from within." Really super cool and super fascinating, and you could say synchronistic, that these two individuals in two different fields discovered each other at about the same time that they were discovering that at the very roots of what they were studying was pretty much the same thing in psychology and physics. I'm really struck by, I think, that third quote from Wolfgang Pauli, where he says, "It's impossible for me to find this correspondence between physics and psychology just through intellectual speculation. It can only properly emerge in the course of the individuation process," which I think is his way of affirming what Carl Jung said in the next quote, that it's only from wholeness can man create a model of the whole. So that in finding this correspondence between physics and psychology, Pauli is saying, you can't do it by thinking about it. It only emerges through the process of individuation, which is like separation of the individual from the whole, which is just really fascinating. That is kind of the paradox of science trying to discover oneness, because science is inherently about observer versus observed, which is inherently separating subject from object. And he's saying if you really want to understand wholeness, you kind of have to erase that separation and become whole, which again, it's just super fascinating. Austin, any thoughts on anything here?
Yeah. First, I guess a disclaimer, just like how, not an expert in quantum physics. I am a big fan of Carl Jung, but not an expert on Carl Jung's ideas. But I'd been a big fan of Carl Jung for a long time, and I didn't even know that he had this correspondence with Wolfgang Pauli until you told me, Jonathan. It is mind-blowing. I also really like that third quote, and just to give it a little context of my own understanding, when Pauli talks about the individuation process, that's actually one of Carl Jung's most central ideas is individuation. And it is a process of becoming more and more individual, but it's more complicated than that because it's not like individualistic. You're not necessarily trying to become separated from everything else. It is more akin, in my mind, to when Ra talks about the path of the adept has to become more and more free from the thoughts and opinions of other selves. So becoming more and more aware of the environment that you're in so that you can make individual decisions and act as an individual instead of acting as sort of an agent of the unconscious collective that you are a part of. And so it's sort of becoming more and more of a co-creator. And you are becoming more and more of an individual. But Carl Jung's idea was as you became more and more of an individual, you became more and more into a relationship with the collective in a more essential, conscious, co-creative way rather than an unconscious way. And so it is not just becoming super individual and separated. It is the process of evolution, as Ra described it. It is, as I understand it, the progression through the energy centers of becoming aware of yourself and your environment, all the distortions that you took on through your socialization, and sort of understanding that you are an individual in the midst of all that, and you can make your own choices. And if we take the spiritual path, that choice is service to others or service to self. And so it's really cool that they both came to this conclusion. I think that Wolfgang Pauli saw that process of what I think is spiritual evolution is essential for coming to an understanding of physics. And then Carl Jung basically said the same thing, that our spiritual evolution is necessary for us to have any idea of the whole model of the universe. So it's really cool that they came to have this relationship and came to these conclusions.
Super fascinating. Thank you for the clarification on individuation, because I really don't know much about Jung at all, and I think I was just kind of giving my own interpretation of that term individuation. So appreciate the clarification. Yasi, anything to add?
I'm just in awe of what an amazing description of that whole thing you just gave. That was so good. I have to go back and like write this down when the recording's available. That was really great. I mean, I can't add really much to it except to say that our like pure, unadulterated kind of understanding of the world does require us to get more and more whole and authentic. And like you said, Carl Jung talks about is just like bringing everything that's in the shadow into the light to really see it for what it is, to really become comfortable with all the aspects of our subconscious, what drives us, what's in there, bring it into like our conscious understanding, and exactly like the progression of the archetypes and how they explain our soul evolution. I mean, he really was kind of speaking to that. And I feel like the best way for us to create that reality and to be a pure, like reflective surface for others, even, the best way that we can let others also understand reality is to be our whole selves, our complete selves, like our most understood version of ourselves. So I love that connection between psychology and physics that way.
It is, absolutely. Yeah. And there is a whole chapter on that in the Quantum Revelation book that I referenced earlier, more details about the relationship between those two, which I had no idea about it until I read fairly recently. Grace, anything to add?
I just really appreciate hearing everyone's perspective. That's helping me gain a better understanding of what I think about this topic. So thank you guys, everyone. Carl Jung once said that his goal was not to be a good man, but a whole man. And to me, Carl Jung really speaks to a person who understood this idea of the number three, the Holy Trinity concept, because when you see him speaking here, he talks about this duality principle between invisible and tangible, conscious, unconscious. And then we're even talking about physics and psychology. We have these two, but there's a third force here. And, when we're speaking about it, it's positive, negative, and neutralizing. And I think that what Carl Jung's wholeness speaks to is that neutralizing factor, is when we can look at both of these things and then we bring it within ourselves, and then we have our own kind of, I guess, assertion of what's happening. I think it really speaks to this idea of being whole.
Fascinating. Yeah, again, something I had not thought of, but makes perfect sense and much appreciated. I did want to note for viewers who were interested in a little bit more background on these two gentlemen. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist and psychotherapist who is regarded as the founder of analytical psychology. He developed the concepts of collective unconscious and synchronicities and archetypes, terms which are all pretty familiar to folks in the Law of One. And he literally wrote the book on synchronicities, which was inspiration for the Police, super popular band in the 80s, to record an album called Synchronicity. I believe Sting was quite into that stuff. And in fact, if you go back and look at that slide of the cover of the Quantum Revolution that I showed at the beginning of this, you'll see that Sting himself gave a nice little recommendation for the book right above the title. Otherwise, yes, Wolfgang Pauli is, again, a Nobel Prize winning physicist who developed the Pauli exclusion principle, which explains why electrons are arranged in its specific shells and subshells within the atom, which is a key to understanding the fundamental structure of matter. And yeah, I believe Pauli met Jung. If I did a little bit of extra researching on it and found that, yeah, Pauli was going through a very difficult time in his life. I suppose you could say dark night of the soul, and he actually sought out help from Jung for his help as a psychoanalyst, and eventually Jung. I think he had him work with one of his assistants first, and then started working with him directly. And yeah, I think he recorded like literally thousands of Pauli's dreams, because for some reason Pauli was just really good at remembering his dreams. And so again, it was through that decades-long collaboration that each of them came to a better understanding both of their own fields and how physics and psychology overlap. So I encourage you to check it out if you're interested in learning more. Otherwise, let's talk a little bit about space-time and time-space. Noted physicist Albert Einstein once said, "People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." Said at another time, "Time is not at all what it seems. It does not flow in only one direction, and the future exists simultaneously with the past." Compare that to what Ross said in session 70, question 12. Ross said, "In time-space, which is precisely as much of yourself as is space-time, all times are simultaneous, just as in your geography, your cities and villages are all functioning, bustling, and alive with entities going about their business at once. So it is in time-space with the self." Really super fascinating, this idea that past, present, and future, what we experience as linear time and space-time is really just an illusion, and that in time-space, which Ross says is the inverse, which is just as real as space-time, that all times exist at the same time. Past, present, and future exist simultaneously with the past. I love the visual that Ra is using. He's saying that just as you see everything in space at one time, just as wherever you're sitting now, all the objects that you see around you all exist at the same time, but it's time that you only kind of exist in one present moment at a time. They're saying in time-space, the opposite is true, that you can see past, present, and future all at the same time, like you see the objects in your room. And it's just space that is kind of locked into one place. It's just super weird and super freaky. And yeah, I can understand why people would have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. What do you think, Yasi? Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, one of the things I love about this idea is not just like our particular life's past, present, and future, but like our progression through the densities. Like sometimes I remind myself that at the same time that I'm existing in third density, my like sixth density soul is also present, that we're existing at the same time. And I either try to tap into that version of myself's sort of like future understanding, progressed nature. I try to like bring in that higher soul understanding in my present moment because I kind of understand that I'm also existing there, at the same time that I'm here. There is the sixth density version of me that's already progressed through all of these things and has all that knowledge and all that wisdom with it, and is existing at the same time. So that blows my mind, I think, but I like it.
Me too. Yes, super fascinating thing to contemplate. Absolutely. Grace, anything to add?
I think I'm just thinking about the experiential piece of this again, that idea of timelessness, but that you can really feel this. And, if you think about like the clock on the wall and you think, okay, you don't have the clock on the wall. Let's say we get rid of that clock on the wall. How do you know what time it is? Is there even a time? And it's such a persistent illusion, and we get so attached to it and identify with it. And then we start saying, okay, the sun's coming up, it must be like 6 a.m. And it's just, we're further building on this idea that doesn't exist, but it's reinforced by each and every one of us and everywhere we look, and it's just crazy. But it's so trippy, like the passage from Ra. I can't conceptualize the opposite of space-time. It just doesn't compute for me. I'm one of those people.
Oh, you and everybody else. Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about this stuff and reflecting on it for years and reading and rereading, and I still don't get it. There were the passages where they've used the metaphor of a field with a stream in it. Quo has many times compared space-time and time-space to like a field with a stream in it, where in space-time, the field is space and time is like the river. So the river is flowing through and moving, whereas space is, you can move around in space, but you can't move around in time. Whereas time-space, which again, they're saying is just as real, it's the opposite. time is the field and space is the river. So you can move around in time, but you cannot move around in space. Still trying to figure that one out. Austin, any thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, I love all the reflections, and it's really interesting to me to see Albert Einstein use this language specifically, because this is language that the Confederation uses. It's like a stubbornly persistent illusion is, how we would describe, especially third density, but, any sort of experience of the creator relies on a stubbornly persistent illusion to enable some sort of experience. You have to have this idea that there was a past and I made a choice and it influenced the future. But, as Grace was saying, once we sort of come to the center of ourselves through meditation, whatever spiritual practice, we can have a direct contact with the knowledge, this experience that it's all a present moment and the time progression is an illusion. And it's still impossible to wrap your head around. But Ra also talks about like the simultaneity of the past and the future, and Yasi was saying that I exist at the same time as my future self, and that's an obvious implication of what Albert Einstein said here. He probably didn't believe in reincarnation, but he had to believe that Albert Einstein at the end of his life existed at the same time as Albert Einstein at the beginning of his life, if he believed this. So it's crazy that he came to these conclusions through science.
Yeah.
It's true.
Well, I believe he is mentioned in the Raw contact as someone who the Confederation did give information to, which
True.
probably had something to do with this, which was, of course, perverted to make weaponry out of. Hey, I wanted to ask you something, Austin. We've been kind of like ignoring the fact that you're a channel up to this point, but the thought did cross my mind as we're talking about time, space, and space time. When you are channeling the entity known as Quo, do you ever feel like you're in some sort of nexus between space time and time space? Do you get a sense of time space that you don't get in your normal conscious waking life?
Yeah, absolutely. The perception of time is definitely different in the channeling state, and it's probably something that like creative people who enter a flow state can experience as well. Um, it can either seem extremely long or extremely condensed. If you get into that flow state, 2 hours could pass and it feels like just a few couple minutes, essentially. So time does seem distorted, and it's hard to like bring that back to space-time and describe what it is like, but there is definitely this in-between sort of aspect of time, space, and space-time in that kind of state.
Fascinating. Yeah, not surprising in the least, for sure. Did want to note for our viewers, we did a podcast episode on channeling a few weeks ago with Austin, as well as Gary Bean and Trisha Bean as panelists, sharing some of their experiences channeling the entity known as Quo. You can check it out on our YouTube channel. Otherwise, panelists, if it's okay with you, I would like to dig a little bit deeper into space-time and time-space. Henry Stapp, who we heard from earlier, once said, "The fundamental process of nature lies outside of space-time, but generates events that can be located in space-time." And the entity known as Quo on December 6, 2003 said, "Things occur within the inner planes long before they begin to appear within the physical plane. The roots of physical experience are often figured as a tree which grows in heaven and whose branches only reach the earth, so that things have already occurred in the root of the tree and in the trunk of the tree of destiny long before they appear as leaf and blossom upon the branches of consensus reality or physical life." Again, I just find this super intriguing and fascinating because to me, it reminds me on one hand of conscious thoughts versus unconscious thoughts, and the suggestion that all the things that manifest as our conscious thoughts really began deep in our subconscious as subconscious thoughts. But the physicist is going one step further and saying that all the processes that happen in space-time in the physical universe as we know it actually have their roots and their beginnings in time space, or this metaphysical universe that we can't see. That again is just another thing to add to the list of mind-blowing things about quantum physics. Grace, any thoughts on any of this?
Nothing from me at the moment.
Yeah. Yeah, this is something that, again, I've read these passages over many times, still trying to kind of understand, wrap my head around. Austin, any thoughts on anything?
Yeah, this is so hard to talk about, especially when you don't are not like an expert in quantum physics. But it makes me think about something in quantum physics that I don't think Henry Stapp is referring to directly here, but it is relevant, and that is that quantum physics kind of breaks our idea of causality. Like that's a big discussion in quantum physics is causality probably doesn't really exist in the way that we think it does, where you have to do one thing and then that leads to this other thing that happened because of that. There are lots of experiments in quantum physics that show that that's not really how things work at the most basic fundamental level of our reality. It only seems to work that way on this macro level. And so we in this illusion think that in order for like a thought to manifest, we have to like do the cause and effect causality thing and make it manifest. Whereas, like Henry Stapp is saying, everything that exists first is like that thought, and then it manifests in some way that is very mysterious, and from our perspective, looks like it has to come about through cause and effect. Carl Sagan said, in order to bake an apple pie or to make an apple pie, you first have to invent the universe. He's like, that's cause and effect. Like, you have to go back to the very
That's
beginning.
great.
You have all the molecules in the universe, and all those billiard balls bounce around and then become an apple pie eventually. But what Henry Stapp is saying is like, that's not necessarily how it works. All that stuff exists somewhere else besides that physical reality. And then it manifests. And from our perspective, it manifests through cause and effect, but probably doesn't really work that way. It's mind-blowing. It's hard to even talk about.
It is. And if I remember correctly, that's basically what synchronicities are. They're events that happen that are acausal,
Right.
things that seem significant but don't seem to have any particular reason for happening in a standard cause and effect way. Like if you take a ball and throw it through a window, then obviously throwing the ball caused the window to break. But if you're just sitting here and you're thinking about a ball crashing through your window, and then 1 second later, a ball comes crashing through your window, then that's kind of weird. That's kind of synchronistic. No particular reason why that should have happened at the
Yeah.
time you were thinking about it. But again, that it seems to be some kind of mind subconscious acausal connection thing, I think.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's the word that Carl Jung used to describe synchronicity was acausal. There's no direct cause and effect that we can observe on any level of space-time, but there is an effect that happens that's related somehow that's not causal. It's like that's a really cool synchronicity between Carl Jung and the quantum physics.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yasi, anything to add?
I mean that this is such a complicated thing, and like Austin, I really like what you're saying about the causality thing. It makes me think of just the idea of like probability of the next step you take, like the next version of you, the immediate next version of you. It's like it is a little bit determined by the immediate previous version of you. You're more probable to like do this next thing than like turn into a flying pig. You know what I mean? So on that idea of like probability, possibility, I guess there is a kind of thing set in motion, and you are more likely to take the next step in that the wave that you're following, even though technically all possibilities are at your disposal, right? There is still kind of like a probability wave, and you're more likely to step into one version than a very far away version from yourself. So that, in a way, seems like a slightly deterministic or slightly already set up path, yet within that there is obviously um just the possibility of everything. So
Yeah, and probabilities, possibilities is another thing that's been talked about a lot in quantum physics and the law of one. And I think we got some passages on that coming up not too long from now. Otherwise, okay, if we take a look at another passage, change subject. I would like to take a closer look at what in the law of one is referred to as, sorry, Did want to mention that if you've enjoyed this discussion on space, time, and time, space, we did a podcast episode on this not too long ago, and it is episode 28, and we go more in depth into many things that were talked about here. Otherwise, let's talk a little bit about something that is referred to in the Law of One as the present moment. Mr. Erwin Schrödinger once said, "For eternally and always, there is only now, one and the same now. The present is the only thing that has no end." Which seems to echo what Kuo said on January 14th, 1996. Kuo said, "When we say open to the present moment, we speak of that present moment which is eternal. Within time, the attempt to grasp the present moment is constantly doomed to failure, for your mind, that is, your earthly intelligence, and the illusion itself were created so that things would occur in an order. In the eternal present moment, all things must exist simultaneously. That which is, and in this fullness of being resides the peace that is so eagerly sought by those who weary of the passing scene. How can one find this present moment? We suggest often the practice of regular contemplation or meditation, for within silence there is that key which unlocks the doors of attention, and into that sanctum sanctorum of the open heart, silent and listening, there resides the Creator, whose name is love." Really love these passages and how they seem to really agree with each other in so many profound ways. I think just as we've talked about taking matter and trying to divide it into its smallest piece, I think that's kind of what the present moment is. It's like what you could consider the smallest unit of time. And when you take the smallest unit time you can think of and break that into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, you get the present moment, which apparently contains eternity. You find infinity at the smallest unit of time. I just find that, again, super fascinating and super beautiful. Austin, any thoughts on anything here?
Just briefly to restate what Kuo said, that first sentence, it seems to go really hand in hand with not just what Schrödinger's saying, but the previous Einstein quote. And they say, we speak of that present moment which is eternal. Within time, the attempt to grasp your present moment is constantly doomed to failure, for your mind, that is your earthly intelligence, and the illusion itself were created so that things would occur in an order. And it's an illusion that it occurs in an order. And that's like exactly what Einstein was saying. So that is really cool. And then I just have another quick quote to share from my own sort of one of my favorite quotes of all time from Joseph Campbell, who was a big fan of Carl Jung. I think Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung's work really go hand in hand. And Joseph Campbell quote, I think it comes from the Power of Myth interviews he did with Bill Moyer. He said, "Eternity isn't some later time. Eternity isn't even a long time. Eternity has nothing to do with time. Eternity is that dimension of here and now that all thinking in temporal terms cuts off. The experience of eternity right here and now in all things, whether thought of as good or as evil, is the function of life." And so that quote's always stuck with me. It's one of my favorites from Joseph Campbell and helps me understand when we talk about eternity, it's not like temporal. It's something more essential than temporal.
Indeed. Yeah. Joseph Campbell, another person who I think is very familiar to folks in the Law of One community. And again, much overlap here for sure. Yasi, anything to add?
Yeah, that was a beautiful quote, Austin. And I think that it's interesting, this idea of eternity and this idea of now, because when you think about, well, I think about the present moment in third dimension, it can't even exist. Like, not only can our intelligent, earthly intelligence not understand it, but like there is no such thing as really a present moment, because the more you zoom in on it, the more the only constant is change. There is like, it's the same way that Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says you can't really zoom in on the properties of a thing because you kind of have to stop it in motion and you have to do this thing to it. It's no longer the thing. That's the same thing for me with time. It's like, is there even a present moment? You know, like, because the minute you look at it, it's already changed. The minute you pause on it, it's already different. Like everything within you is different. Everything about that moment is different. And so you keep delving further and further in, and maybe that's where you get close to eternity. In the same way that in the particle idea, the closer you divide something, the more you get close to an undividable thing. Maybe the closer you get to the present moment is really the undividable eternity, because that's the only place where there is no progress of change, I guess, right? Which would give the order of sequence of events. So I find that heady.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, whenever I think about present moment, I'm thinking that, yeah, everything that's not the present is an illusion. Anything in the future hasn't happened yet. That's not real. Anything in the past happened already. That's not real. So the only real thing is the present. But as soon as you say the present, it's already in the past. So it's somehow at that very cutting edge, like we said, the smallest unit of time you
Yeah.
can think of contains infinity, just like the
And
smallest
yet,
particle contains infinity, apparently.
exactly. And yet, like that understanding of the present moment, like changed my life. I mean, to be able to reside in the present moment, to be present in the present moment, like changed my life. So it is also something, right? So
Super
it's a
powerful. Yeah.
contradiction.
I think Eckhart Tolle wrote a book on the
Oh
power
yeah,
of
that was
now,
one
right?
of my top five life-changing.
For a lot of people. Grace, anything to add?
Yeah, I really like that you mentioned your struggle with this, Yasi, because it's something that I think we all struggle with because, like Quo said here, it's you can't grasp it conceptually with your intellect. So we're talking about this concept, but it doesn't exist as a concept. It exists as a direct experience. It's the same thing of finding that I principle. Where is it? As soon as you look, it's gone. Where is now? As soon as you look, it's gone. But
Exactly.
yet, it is the only thing that exists. It's the only thing behind it all. And when you are silent, as Quo says, truly silent, you can get a taste of that. And I just personally, I've only recently gotten to that place, and it is nothing that you can experience with your human senses. So you have to sit there and be willing to experience something that you have never experienced before. It's not describable, yet we attribute these terms like eternal or endlessness, but it doesn't describe the experience of it.
Indeed.
So true.
Yeah, so
So true.
true. Absolutely. I wanted to take a look at a different subject, if you guys don't mind. I'm trying to be mindful of the time and seeing that we're already like more than an hour and a half in, but we're getting somewhat near the end. Are we okay with moving on to a different subject? Anybody else have anything wanted to add on this? That's good. So let's go ahead and take a look at something that, as we mentioned, has been talked about quite a bit in quantum physics as well as in the law of one, and that is probabilities and possibilities. Werner Heisenberg once said, "The transition from the possible to the actual takes place during the act of observation." John Wheeler said, "There are innumerable clouds of probability running around in the universe that have yet to trigger some registered event in the macroscopic world." Wheeler was really very much a scientific mystic. He definitely had a lot of mystical outlooks on quantum physics that came through in his studies and his writings. And this seems to be somewhat similar to what Ross said in session 67, question 12. "We may note at this point, while you ponder the possibility-probability vortices, that although you have many, many items which cause distress and thus offer seeking and service opportunities, there is always one container in that store of peace, love, light, and joy. This vortex may be very small, but to turn one's back upon it is to forget the infinite possibilities of the present moment. Could your planet polarize towards harmony in one fine, strong moment of inspiration? Yes, my friends, it is not probable, but it is ever possible." One of my favorite passages, and one that I think is a favorite of many students and teachers, the Law of One, especially when things seem really distressful, as they can these days. That reminder that it's possible. Just have to think that there is always that one vortex, possibility, probability vortex, that everything that our planet could harmonize. One strong moment of inspiration. Any thoughts on this, Yazi?
Yes, I think of the idea of focusing, I mean, not just observation, but what you focus on becomes reality. So I guess like in a physics sense, you observe the possible, everything everywhere all at once. You take a moment to look at it, and then it kind of collapses into that moment of like actual physical material beingness. And in the same way, like when we focus on a particular thing, we kind of make that one thing more real. We help it take shape. We bring it more into the material universe than the other possible probabilities. And to me, that on a day-to-day basis is such an important guiding factor because it really gives you such choice moments on what you focus on, whether it's in an event or a particular moment in your life, or let's say like the negative attributes of somebody around you. Like, let's say somebody who always annoys you and you're constantly focusing on that annoying aspect of their personality. I feel like you are helping that person actualize that version of themselves because you are not a passive observer. Your observation helps bring reality into creation, So I think that observation and focus are such essential components to us as co-creators, and they can really determine our reality and what it looks like. And obviously, we're joined together in one general focus, like when all of us focus on something in a particular way, it really does help solidify that particular reality into existence. So I think it's a pretty powerful thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess as you were speaking, it caused a thought to cross my mind that, yeah, that possibility, probability vortex of our planet polarizing towards harmony in one strong moment of inspiration in many ways exists already. It's already in the future because the future is happening at the same time as the past. And perhaps
It's
it is a
true.
matter of us connecting to it in some way to help actualize it and to observe it and manifest it. Grace, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was thinking, Yasi, about focus, and I guess the word for me, like when I think about focus, I think of attention. Those are two sides of the similar coin here, but
So true.
I think about attention and how divine our attention is, and how we have been socialized to not give our attention perhaps the respect it deserves. And companies know this. Companies have capitalized on using our attention in ways that are deleterious to our being. So it made me think about that.
That's so
Um,
true.
and the last sentence here that Ross stated, speaking about the planet being able to polarize towards harmony, I apply that to myself. I have all these grander ideas about helping everyone else, but when I bring it back to myself, it feels much more probable. So I just keep that in mind and just try to polarize my damn self.
Yeah, well said. And, even if the planet doesn't polarize in one big fell swoop, I think we have been assured many times by our friends in the Confederation that planet is already vibrating in fourth density completely. It's just humanity that's kind of lagging behind and clinging to third density ways of looking at things and living in the world. But again, in many ways, Earth already exists as a fourth density positive planet in the future. We're just kind of catching up to it and trying to help manifest it. And I think we do that by doing exactly what you said. You just act in unconditional love and vibrate in fourth density. And that's how we help bring that future closer to present, I think. Austin, anything to add?
Yeah, there's so many thoughts that I was were triggered by this quote and Grace and Yassi's reflections. And I think it's hard to collect them, but it makes me think about the macrocosm and the microcosm and the terminologies that we're using. The first thing it makes me think about in these quotes from Heisenberg and Wheeler is they're talking about quantum physics that they can observe in our time, our like world, but in the grandest sense, this also makes me think about how Ra describes intelligent infinity and the aspect of the potential and the kinetic. I think that is related to what Heisenberg's describing here is there's things that exist as possible or potential, and then they take place once they are observed, the kinetic. So there's a potential and a kinetic in that. And I think that it makes me wonder, even like Yassi was using the term focus, Ra uses the term focus to describe that process on the grandest scale of that potential becoming kinetic. There's a kinetic focus that happens to that potential. So it's like in the grandest sense, the universe exists as one large field of probability, possibility, potential. But then once we start manifesting, our whole existence and everything that we can observe exists as littler fields of probabilities and possibilities and potentials. And our ability to focus, which seems to be like similar to the creator's ability to focus, brings those things into being, brings those things from being potential into the kinetic. And it just is another mind-blowing thing about, quantum physics being so related to cosmology as Ra describes it. There seems to be such an interconnected aspect to it.
Gee. Yeah, and you're triggering me by bringing up potential and kinetic energy, which I haven't thought about since my high school physics class, I think, a long time ago. But yeah, now that you mention it, yeah, that makes perfect sense and kind of fits in with everything here. Which I think would be a great segue into the last topic that we're going to look at. Did anybody have any last thoughts they wanted to share on this screen before I change it?
Just one thought here. This quote by Heisenberg, I think, speaks to again that Trinity principle that I believe Carl Jung embodies in his statement of wholeness, this idea of possible, one, actual, another, but then observation being that third neutralizing force that really brings it through.
Nice.
That's cool.
Was that Heisenberg the physicist or Heisenberg the crystal meth dealer from Breaking Bad?
The blue crystal meth dealer.
Okay, I thought so. Yeah, I knew there was something there. Well, let us segue into one last topic that we've already mentioned quite a fair bit, and that is something that's mentioned a lot in the Law of One, and that is the idea that we are co-creators of reality. Physicist Vlatko Vidril once said, rather than passively observing it, we create reality. John Wheeler again said, no elementary phenomenon is a phenomenon until it is an observed phenomenon. And the entity known as Quo on May 6, 2007 said, you are part of something that is in exquisite balance. You are in touch with the spirit world and the highest energies, and at the same time, you are in touch with your earth and its heaviest energies. You know of everything from angels and cherubim to the degradation of war, murder, torture, and the evil that entities can do to each other. And your gaze is that gaze which orders things in the world. So perhaps we would say that your most creative means of control is to create the world that you would like to see and live it. For you truly are a co-creator, and you truly can create the reality that you wish to see. Super encouraging, and definitely not the impression one would get from like watching the news or paying attention to current events, which seem designed to make us feel powerless and out of control of anything. So I think what we're seeing from our physicist friends, as well as our Confederation friends, is that each of us is, at the deepest level, the creator, the one infinite creator, and we all have that power of the creator in us to create the reality as we experience it. And I guess the thought that comes to my mind a lot recently is that you cannot necessarily change what happens in the outer world, but you can change how you respond to it in the inner world. And in many ways, the best way to change the outer world really is to change the inner world and to channel that one original thought of love and the one infinite creator as best we can in our own lives every day, every moment, and all our interactions with each other. I think we do have that ability to create that reality that we want to see. Beautiful thought I would like to take away. Grace, any thoughts on anything here?
Yeah, I think like I'm looking at the fields of physics and psychology, and I just feel like physics is like really out there. Look at this profound statement. Like, wow, holy cow, right? Psychology would never say something like this in current day, at least. You know, we're too busy on pathologizing normal things. But
And taking drugs
So
for them.
true.
Yeah.
and yes, taking drugs, yes, the pharmaceuticals, yes, we love that. But I love what you said, Jonathan, about taking it into our own hands, being co-creators and choosing how we want to respond to things. That's where our power lies. And I think that we all strive as seekers to really use that power to bring forth more of the creator's love.
Indeed. Indeed. Austin, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree that this is incredibly empowering. And that's something about the Law of One and Confederation philosophy that I appreciate the most is like how empowering it is. It asks us to take radical responsibility, but with that responsibility, we have like infinite potential to, shape our own experience. I think this is where a lot of quantum physicists would kind of depart from the spiritual interpretation of things. I don't think that many especially modern quantum physicists would say that we don't create our reality in the sense that we can like influence what is manifest. It's just our act of observing it causes it to collapse in some random way. That's how a lot of them would interpret that. But I think we're getting to a point where once we start looking more and more at the implications of, as the physicists were saying earlier, everything is mind-based and we have mind. How does that mind interacting with itself, there has to be some way that we have some kind of influence or power or some sort of connection to that fundamental substance of mind that they're talking about and our ability to bring reality into beingness like they say that we do. So I think that's really cool. And then one small connection just to what we were talking about earlier with Carl Jung and individuation. I always understood his concept of individuation to be basically becoming a conscious co-creator like Kuo is saying here, where we become so aware of our whole selves and we are aware of how we're being influenced by everything around us that we can make a truly conscious choice and a truly conscious ability to perceive our reality and choose how to react and respond to that reality without instinct, without unconscious baggage. It's becoming so truly aware of your whole individual self that you can then choose a reality you want to manifest in on some level. I don't know how free we can really be in that sense, but there is some level of influence we can have.
Yeah, agreed. I think it reminds me of what I've been told many times is that if you want to see negative things in the world, that's all you're going to see. There is no shortage of negative things to see in the world. But if you want to see positive things, then guess what? You're going to see that there's a ton of positive things happening in the world. So in many ways, I guess that's just another saying we create the reality we want to see, I guess, and we see what we want to see and don't see what we don't want to see. Yasi, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, you guys all said it so eloquently. The one thing that sometimes I think about creating or co-creating is I always think of the idea of reflecting. And recently I looked this concept up again. I love it. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of this thought experiment that's in Hinduism and Buddhism called the net of Indra. It's this idea that there's this like vast, infinite net and like a spider's web and at every little connecting point is like a particular phenomenon or a person and it's like a jewel and every little contact point has one and each jewel is reflecting not only the jewel next to it but every other jewel and every reflection from that jewel and is also reflecting onto the others. So I so often think of our connections to each other and our ability to co-create as what we're reflecting, not just what's being reflected off of us, but what we're reflecting onto others. And I think in that way, we have a lot of autonomy by making sort of sure that our jewel, our particular jewel, is as clear and vibrantly reflective as we can make it, so that we're at least not projecting a reflection onto the rest of, you know, the world that isn't what we would want to see reflected back at us. Exactly like you said, Jonathan. Like if we project anger because something makes us angry, that's just getting reflected back all throughout the net. You know, we're not helping anything get better by projecting that outwards. So yeah, anyways,
It's a
that's
beautiful lesson, beautiful teaching. I appreciate your sharing that with our viewers. I learned about Indra's net, I don't know, a few years ago, and it really blew me away too also, and seems to echo the whole idea of the holographic universe where each
yeah,
part
exactly.
contains the whole also.
Yeah.
Hindus have been saying that for a long time. Uh, I think we are at a good point to start wrapping things up. Panelists, did you have any last thoughts you wanted to share on this passage before we wrap things up? Sounds good. So where do we go from here? What are some good takeaway lessons? I would hope after hanging out with our 2-hour conversation here, if you don't remember anything else, if you remember that quantum physics is not as hard to understand as you thought, that would be a wonderful thing. If you can remember that quantum physics is basically the science of oneness, I would say that would be a fair way to characterize it. Because quantum physics is about how the universe works at the smallest level. And at the smallest level, quantum physicists would seem to agree that all is one unbroken whole. And that means, among many other things, that linear time is an illusion. Past, present, and future all exist at the same time. Just meditate on that one for a while and see where you could go with it. And lastly, that we do co-create reality in spite of all appearances to the contrary. We do control the reality, or we can co-create the reality that we live in. Panelists, any last thoughts, reflections, takeaway lessons of your own you want to add? Austin?
I just appreciate everything that everybody shared. I really loved this conversation. Really appreciated being invited to it. Thank you, Jonathan. I want to shout out that book that you were mentioning again. It's the Quantum Revelation. I didn't get a chance to actually read through it, but I thumbed through it. And there's another book, it's kind of similar to this one that I would also recommend. It's a collection of essays from a lot of the same physicists, and it's called Quantum Questions, and it's compiled by Ken Wilber, who's one of my favorite teachers. And he also writes commentary in it, and it's basically about this, but it's a longer form essays from all of these physicists about their own beliefs of mysticism and how they were at the same time very hardcore scientists and mystics. And they had this thread of mysticism that seems totally lost to modern science, and they're the ones who were like the last real pioneers of physics, it seems.
Yeah, science and mysticism, who'da thunk? But yeah, indeed, makes perfect sense. Thank you for the book reference, and I hope our viewers check into that. Yasi, anything you want to add? Any takeaway lessons of your own or final thoughts, reflections before we have a pop quiz?
Well, first of all, I want to echo Austin in saying that it's a true privilege to have been in this conversation with you guys. And Jonathan, thank you for setting up such a like wonderful platform for this. And this particular subject is, I was a science nerd, and actually learning about quantum physics is what opened up my mystical side. So the fact that I can merge these two, that I have found raw and really truly feel it to be the true metaphysical understanding of the universe, and I can merge that with science in this way, just really makes me happy. So
We are so happy to have you here and hope to have you on again
yes.
in future episodes. Grace, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I love the way the creator comes through, you guys. What a great conversation. I really enjoyed everyone's perspectives. That was really great. I guess a leaving quote would be from Gurdjieff. When you study man, you study the cosmos. And when you study the cosmos, you study man. So kind of goes back to that quantum physics idea.
Nice.
Beautiful.
So beautiful. Thank you. Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's been super special, super enjoyable, and hope to get all three of you back on panels again for future discussions. Did want to remind our viewers that if you enjoyed hearing from Austin today, check out our podcast episode number 24 on channeling. We had Austin as well as Gary and Trisha Bean on to share some of their experiences channeling the entity known as Quo. Beautiful episode, well worth checking out. Otherwise, it is time for pop quiz. Indeed, pop quizzes, of course, are something we like to do as a fun way to end our conversations and maybe look at interesting connections between the law of one and pop culture. So since today's episode was on quantum physics, it seems only fitting that we should have a pop quiz on one of the founders of quantum physics, quoted a couple of times in our session today, and probably the most well-known scientist among the general public, just in terms of people who recognize that name. Know who I'm talking about, panelists?
Albert Einstein.
That's what I was going to say.
Albert Einstein, indeed. Yes, yes. This picture, do you guys know the story behind this iconic photo of Einstein?
No.
No.
Apparently, I mean, it is a real photo. I thought maybe it was photoshopped or something, but no, it is a real photo. I think it happened the evening of his 72nd birthday. He was at some event where they were celebrating him and his birthday, and on his way out to the car, photographers were asking him to smile for the camera, and he was just tired of it because that's what he'd been doing the whole night already. So he just made this face. But he loved the picture. Apparently, when he saw the picture, he loved it and kind of made it his photo that he would add to correspondences. So today, should mention, yes, interestingly enough, Einstein is, as far as I can tell, he's only mentioned once out of 1,800 plus channeling sessions. But that one time is an interesting one, and that was in the Raw Contact. Session 26, question 20. The questioner said, in the recent past of the last 30 to 40 years of the UFO phenomenon has become known to our population. What was the original reason for, I know there have been UFOs throughout history, but what was the original reason for the increase in what we call UFO activity in the past 40 years? And Ra said, I am Ra. Information which the Confederation sources had offered to your entity, Albert Einstein, became perverted and instruments of destruction began to be created, examples of this being the Manhattan Project and its product being the atom bomb that was dropped on Japan. Information offered through Wanderer sound vibration, Nikola Tesla, also being experimented with for potential destruction. Example, your so-called Philadelphia experiment. Thus, we felt a strong need to involve our thought forms in whatever way we of the Confederation could be of service in order to balance these distortions of information meant to aid your planetary sphere. It just seems the whole history of contact between the Confederation and humanity has been them trying to give us things to help us and us turning them into weapons of destruction and aggression and war and bellicosity. No wonder they stopped showing up in our skies.
They really don't understand humans. They keep giving us
Yeah,
stuff.
exactly. They're way too hopeful.
Naive, I believe, was the word they have used more than a few times to describe their mistaken impressions of humanity. Anyway, let's see. We're going to do our pop quiz a little bit differently today. I am not going to ask you multiple choice questions. I have 3 true-false questions about Albert Einstein. See how many you can get correct. As always, the points don't matter. If you had fun, you won. If you learned something interesting about Einstein that you didn't know before, that you can drop into a conversation with normal people the next time you have to hang out with them, then you won as well. Panelists, you ready for your first question?
Let's do it.
True or false? Einstein failed math class in high school. It is something that has been said about him many times. Is it true or false? Panelists, you can just say the answer.
I want to say false just because how could that be?
I'm
Yeah,
going
I
to
think
say
it's a myth.
true.
I'll say false.
Nice. As it turns out, the correct answer is true and false. Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, I'm looking at the wrong question. Sorry. The answer is false. But there's a reason for it. Apparently, he did quite well, not surprisingly, in math in high school. But the high school that he was attending apparently changed their norm grading system like halfway through his senior year. So instead of letter grades, I think they used to give numbers 1 through 5. So at one point, a part of his high school math classes, he received 1s, which were like the highest grade. And then he received 5s for another math class because they changed it, and 5 was actually the highest grade, but it was perceived as being the lowest grade. So there's some confusion with the grading
That was
system.
hard math. That was hard math.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Let's try another one. How about this? True or false? Einstein was a vegetarian.
True.
Also something that I think has been said about him more than a few times.
True.
I'm going true.
It's a good guess. Yasi?
True.
I said true.
True.
Oh, am I frozen?
I think so. I didn't hear. Did you say something?
I
True.
heard her say true a couple times.
Oh, I must have been on my end. Apparently, the correct answer is true and false. Apparently, he had a lot of digestive problems before age 50. He had stomach ulcers, jaundice, inflammation of the gallbladder, intestinal pains, and so on. So because of that, his doctors advised him not to eat meat. So he did eat meat on occasion, and he did agree with the ethical arguments against eating meat. So he was vegetarian for the most part, but not by choice. It was mainly because he had to.
Sounds like the
And
curse of a wanderer.
seriously. And I think he died from that, didn't he? He died from his stomach issues.
Oh, I did not know that.
I think so, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, we're going to put that on the next pop quiz. Are you ready for your last question? True or false? Einstein was the inspiration for Yoda.
What? I want that to be
Another
true.
thing that has been said more than a few times about him.
Yeah, that seems like George Lucas thing to do. I'd say true.
I'm going true.
Nice.
True.
Cassie?
True.
Yeah, very well done. Yeah, in fact, it was true. They were developing the Yoda character for The Empire Strikes Back in the early 1980s. So Star Wars creator George Lucas hired special effects artist Stuart Freeborn to bring the character to life. And as chance or luck or synchronicity would have it, there just happened to be a photo of Einstein hanging on the wall in the room where he was working. So he ended up kind of making Yoda a combination of both Einstein and kind of his own elfish looking face there.
Wow, that's crazy. He looks so much like him. The body.
Yeah,
For sure.
it was like a mix between him and Einstein, like exactly.
Totally.
Totally. Yeah. Well, and speaking of Yoda and speaking of Einstein and speaking of mysticism as came up, I did have one last quote to share with you all. Albert Einstein once said, "The most beautiful emotion we can experience is the mystical, is the source of all true art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead."
Wow.
So I am so happy to be alive and that you guys are alive and that we got to share this time together. So thank you so much for being here. Panelists, thank you for all you've done and continue to do in service to others. To all our friends at L&L Research, thank you for all you've done and continue to do in service. To everyone who's watching this on video in the near or distant future, thank you for all you've done and continue to do in service to others. We are sending you our love light and we are receiving yours. Until next time. And the love and light of the One Infinite Creator. Adonai. Namaste.